All right, good morning, everyone. Frank, thank you for joining BCW on the main stage. I have to say I'm really excited for today's conversation, not just because we've been friends for a long time, I've known you for a long time. Like everyone else here this morning who's gotten up early, I'm a huge fan of your writing, a Bruni fanboy. But I think especially in this moment of dramatic uncertainty, almost craziness in the world coming off of a global pandemic, inflation, loss of reproductive rights here, war in Europe, and on and on and on. It's such an uncertain time. I think all of us can use a little Frank Bruni helping us, if not feel hopeful about what's to come, at least understand how to navigate it, especially those of us in the communications profession. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I don't know how I perform on the Vessel of Hope tangent, but we'll see. Yeah.
Help us understand at least. I did want to start though with the personal. About 5 years ago, something happened to you. No one here today looking at you, listening to you today would know about it if they didn't already hear about it. It's profoundly changed your life, and I'd love it if you could share a little about that experience with everyone.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I woke up one morning almost exactly 5 years ago, and I could not see anymore properly out of my right eye. And it turned out that I'd had a rare stroke that had frazzled that optic nerve forevermore. So my right eye just really doesn't function. And I've had to learn to do things with just one eye, and my brain has had to figure out how to edit my right eye out of the equation. But I was also told that what happened to me, there's a 20% chance it will happen to my left eye. And so I had to adjust to the idea. I mean, 20% odds are good, but the stakes are really high. So I live forevermore with this sort of sword hanging over me, which is, will I wake up one morning and the left eye will be gone, and then it's a whole new ballgame.
And you took this experience and you decided to write about it and delve into it. Most of us would be sort of, I speak for myself, so focused on panic, getting better, and you instead chose a different course. And really
no, I did panic for sure. I did panic, I did self-pity, I did all of that. But I mean, if you write for a living, I realized that what was happening to me, the sorts of big questions I was facing, how do you live with your uncertainty being, writ that clearly? How do you deal with physical limitations? Those are huge questions for anyone who's aging. And I wrote a long essay about it for the Times. And people immediately said, this feels upsizable to a book. So, I was really lucky enough in the last decade of her life to become good friends with Nora Ephron. And Nora Ephron had a famous saying, which is, everything is copy. Copy is an old-fashioned newspaper term for material words. And she was just basically saying, if you make your living in the trade of words and something interesting and universalable or whatever happens to you, you use it. Because it will be cathartic for you and it will be instructive for other people.
And I know you spoke to others who went through similar changes. How was that received? I mean, I know some were family, friends, but to go to someone who's gone through a similar situation, physical devastation, life-changing injury or accident, including our mutual friend Bob Carey, who lost a lot of his leg in Vietnam. I mean, how was their response in terms of being open? Did you seek people who were already talking about
No, I didn't,
publicly?
and I'm glad you brought up Bob, because he's a good example. I assume you all know who Bob Carey is, former Nebraska senator, governor. You and I have been friends with Bob for a while. We've all had dinner together, et cetera. And I had never asked Bob about the missing portion of his leg. I just assumed, Right. I mean, I just assumed that's going to be a downer. He's going to feel it's invasive. It's not something he wants to talk about. And so when I started gathering material for the book, I said, Bob, I have a weird question. Can we go to lunch, and would you be willing to essentially do an interview where we talk about what happened to you in Vietnam and how you rebounded from it? He was grateful, because in fact, too few people ask him about that. And what I learned, whether I was talking to Bob about that or to other people in my life about challenges they'd had that I'd never investigated or explored with them before, is in our fear of messiness and in our excess of courtesy, we do not give people a chance to talk about things that they in fact would very much like to talk about. And we don't give ourselves the chance to access the wisdom they have about navigating life's challenges. So, I mean, there are all of these people around us who have insights and wisdom that we never access because we're being polite, because we're afraid it will be messy, because we just don't pause long enough. And doing the book has been an education in that, and I live differently now.
Yeah, it's interesting, because not every journey that people are on is visible. And one of the big
Most
issues,
aren't.
right? And one of the biggest issues that's come up in a very positive way during the pandemic when we talk about employer-employee relationships is conversations about mental wellness. Most people, I think probably all people, dealt with some trauma over the last 3 years in navigating this, even if they didn't have special consideration, but sort of making it okay to talk about those issues and our struggles, even with our employers, and to get help from our employers has been a really interesting and positive change to come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, no, we're getting, as a society, in terms of workplace culture, we're getting better and better at that. And so much is invisible. The portion of my book that the Times chose to excerpt, right, before it was being published, was from a chapter called The Sandwich Board Theory of Life, where I talk about how different the world would be if we all just a couple days a year or a day a month walked around with sandwich boards that listed the things that we'd survived, the things we were going through that were not visible to the naked eye. We would be far less hasty in our judgments about people. We'd be quicker to empathy, but we'd also have a much more accurate measure of where we stood in things. I think it's so tempting to look at the people around you and say, she's on a glide path. He has nothing but good luck, they over there, they're in clover all of the time. You have no idea what really has been going on in their lives. And if you knew, you would be much less tempted to fall into the pit of self-pity.
Speaking of the Times excerpt, the book has received some really sensational reviews, and you've been interviewed by some amazing people, from Seth Meyers to Terry Gross. One in particular, I know from our conversation, blew your mind. It certainly blew my mind. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how that came to pass.
Yeah, well, I had that author's dream come true, which is as my publicist was rounding up interviews and saying, this person wants to talk to you, that person wants to talk to you. She called me one day and she said, I have a bit of good news. Oprah wants to talk to you, which is, that's like, that's basically like saying God has a moment for you, Now, it wasn't, she doesn't have a TV show anymore, so it was for her website. But I was so excited, and then I completely botched the whole thing. So I was in my living room, and her team, she has such a team. They're sprawling, they're meticulous. So in the days before this Zoom thing, I had to take them with my iPad through my entire house so they could choose the room I would be in and the backdrop. They sent me like sophisticated sound measurement things. We did all these tests. Like there was no way. I think they sent me about $500 in special equipment to use that they didn't even ask back. I still have it in a drawer at home. It was one and done. But I was so excited, and then the interview happens, and Oprah starts, and while we're live with her Oprah community, she goes on and on about how Frank doesn't know this, but he's one of my favorite people in the world. And I know he occasionally sees Gayle King. And I'm always calling her and saying, I'm really jealous. How come I can't talk to Frank? And I'm thinking, Oprah, just call. I'll pick up the phone, But then she asks me, because there's a whole chapter in my book, maybe a good idea, maybe not, about my relationship with my dog and how important that was. And then she asked me if she can see Regan. Like Regan had a chance to make an Oprah quasi-television debut. I had boarded Regan for the night lest she bark and interrupt anything. So I missed that. And then at the end of the thing, she said, thank you, we were through the tape portion. I did the computer equivalent of hanging up the phone, and then I began to pour myself like a really tall glass of wine to just sort of wind down. And I get a call on my cell phone saying, Frank, where are you? Oprah's looking for you. She likes to have a long, post-production chat afterwards. I had to zoom back in because I had basically hung up on Oprah Winfrey. So.
Nice. Well done.
So that's probably my first and last Oprah encounter.
I doubt that, but that's very funny. Speaking of funny, we had one conversation before today's panel to sort of go over what we would talk about, and we both agreed, since it's Frank Bruni, if there was some interesting breaking news, we would talk a little about that, even if it's not on topic, about corporations taking a stand and brands taking a stand in this crazy divided world. And then we get Kanye. Adidas. Big news this week, exactly on point for this conversation, and especially interesting, I would imagine, for this audience who every day is counseling clients around similar issues. How did they do? What's your take on?
Well, the way it is being received is that they were very late to do this, right? So I mean, if one is looking for lessons here, you never get credit if you wait until what people feel is the last possible moment, right? But I think if you step back, I think there's a larger lesson here. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Right now, Kanye wasn't saying the sorts of, do we say Kanye, do we say yay, do we say ye?
I think whatever you want.
Yay? Okay, yeah. At
Yay.
least it's not Prince with the glyph. That was,
That was always a tough one.
that was harder because it had no pronunciation, yeah. And was a glyph, right? Yeah. But I mean, I think the larger kind of long-term wide-angle lesson here is if you're going to be in the business of partnering with celebrities, if you're going to use celebrity, I mean, that was a more intricate partnership, but if you're going to simply use celebrities as pitch people, you need to think about that long-term versus short-term. You're not only hiring that person and all of the connotations of that person at the present moment, you're hiring everything they've done in the past, which could come back, so do research, and you're hiring what might happen in the future. And I think corporations should and will be a lot more cognizant of that as a result of this Kanye, yay situation.
Yeah, I mean, there was sort of a long history of clues in terms of someone who was most likely unwell, and many brands just sort of dove in because.
But this isn't new. I was refreshing my memory this morning. I was just kind of thinking back. Do you remember the Whoopi Goldberg Slim Fast fiasco?
No.
So I mean, we're bad in general as people, and we're bad in the media at seeing things in a historical context and remembering. We like to portray things as new and novel because that seems more newsworthy, rather than saying, well, this is just X situation on steroids. But back in, I think it's 2004, because it was during the John Kerry campaign, Whoopi Goldberg was, she was a spokesperson for Slim Fast. And she went out on stage somewhere in her role as campaigning against Bush's reelection and for Bob Kerrey, and she had a bottle of wine with her, I believe, and she began making extremely graphic and crude jokes about the name Bush and other things it could mean. And that was the end of Slim Fast's relationship with Whoopi Goldberg. But this happens when you're in the business of taking the shortcut of a celebrity association to signal certain things about your brand, to reach certain people. There's a risk involved.
So let's take this to the more serious, broader issue and sort of the crux of the conversation today. We're taking celebrity off the table. I mean, we're in, as I opened with, a wild moment. And employers, corporations, and brands are increasingly getting pressure from their employees and their customers to take stands on the important issues of our time. I think that only accelerated during COVID around George Floyd and the fight for racial equity and Black Lives Matter, continued on with Dobbs and the loss of reproductive rights in this country, feared threats to marriage equality as a result of that decision, and LGBTQ rights. So you have young employees pressuring their companies to take stands, right, on these issues, to speak out. And then you have, in my sense, really for the first time, a tremendous backlash coming from red states that can impact and will impact and is impacting bottom line, right? Whether it's the Disney example on Don't Say Gay, whether it's ESG investing in Texas and pension funds, a real cost to this stuff, including threats to come after companies and even arrest CEOs who are paying for women to travel outside of states to access reproductive health care. What's a brand, what's a corporation to do? Do you view this as well as novel or accelerated?
I think this is going to be the new normal for a long time. And as you said, there are two things going on. One is, I think, the relationship between worker and workplace, between employee and corporation, has completely changed. That has to do with kind of wider cultural, and sociological forces. But employees expect a degree of consideration and even validation from their workplaces, and they've been given more power to demand that by things like, the worker shortage, the big quit. So they have a totally different relationship that I think makes it very difficult for many corporations, many companies, to completely take a pass on certain values in politics. But at the same time, you have an entirely new paradigm with the Republican Party. And I'm not saying this in any partisan way, I'm just saying this diagnostically, analytically. The Republican Party, which was the party of big business, which was the party, friendly to private enterprise, is increasingly demonizing and vilifying companies for doing things that they believe are putting their thumb on the political scale. You mentioned the ESG stuff. Do I have those initials correct? I'm always mixing up my initials. But I last night, as I was just doing my usual media comb, not anything special because we were going to be chatting here right now, I noticed the evening newsletter of Axios. How many people get or are familiar with Axios? So some of you may have seen this, but it wasn't a surprise in the context of other things that have prepared us for it, but if you just kind of went back 5 years ago and then flashed forward, it would be a huge surprise. It was talking about how Fortune 500 companies, in anticipation of Republicans taking the House majority after the midterms, were desperately vying for and trying to find DC law firms with ins with Republicans because it is expected that there will be hearings and investigations in the House by the Republican majority that will seek to shame and punish corporations that have been seen as doing things in the service of the woke ideology. That's totally new. In some ways, it feels like the logical endpoint from 2015 and 2016 when Donald Trump sort of set a new paradigm by using his Twitter account to rage at any company whose policies he didn't like. Macy's wasn't selling his stuff anymore, so he went after them. But this is different. There used to be not a wall, but there used to be much more distance between what corporations were doing and how politicians reacted to it as a matter of kind of public policy. That's gone, and I don't think any company can fail to recognize that. I think every company has to consider that and do what they will with it, but they can't be caught unaware.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I also did a little bit of research on the Trump stuff. I mean, there's a long history of presidents criticizing the press, right? Objecting to unfair coverage. We've never seen the kind of criticism leveled at corporations and brands as we saw in the Trump years on Twitter.
He called for boycotts of places.
Of actual companies, and just because he didn't like them. I mean, he called the failing New York Times, right? Yeah. He went after Amazon. He went after Boeing because
he went after CNN's corporate parent at the time. Sure. Yeah, there were no. I mean, Trump is a sort of kind of one-man metaphor for collapsed boundaries. We don't have a lot of the boundaries in this life, in this country, in this world that we used to have. And that's one of the lessons here. And I think part of that has to do with the internet and social media, right? Our digital lives follow us into every single corner of our lives. And that means work, that means home. And who we are in our digital lives and the things that, the things we interact with digitally, those don't get put in any one box. And that's part of what is dissolving all these boundaries.
So interesting, you mentioned the Republican Party. I don't want to call them out, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. Mike Bloomberg, who I should say I did work for 4 years when he was mayor in New York City, wrote a piece, obviously, in Bloomberg recently, speaking to the ESG movement that you mentioned, and essentially saying states like Texas that are penalizing financial institutions for investing in clean energy or trying to get out of fossil fuels is really anti-Republican, right? The Republican values have always been about a free market, and if Goldman Sachs, just to pick one, decides that they're going to get a better return on Frank Bruni's investment by investing in clean energy than sticking fully in fossil fuel, that's something we encourage. Well, but yet, but now they're actually passing laws preventing large state pension funds. There are very few economies bigger than Texas in the world, or Florida, from investing with financial institutions who are making these decisions that we have to believe, if it's coming from the Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanleys of the world, are in the best interest of their investors.
Well, I think Republicans, I mean, I'm not an economics finance guy, but I think Republicans would argue that part of what offends them about some of these decisions is they're not decisions that look solely at the bottom line. They're about kind of sculpting a world and about kind of steering the world in a direction that you think is important based on your values. But to your point about regulations, Republicans have always been, the whole conservative ideology, but whether conservative and Republican go hand in hand anymore is very much in dispute, but was, let the markets be free. Free markets, free people. It's not a free market if you're passing laws saying if you invest according to these values or these strategies, we will punish you.
We've talked a little bit around being a divided country, and it's manifesting itself in ways that I think many of us haven't experienced in our lifetime, probably since the Civil War. When you say we've always had disagreements around culture, we've never seen states, as we just discussed, come after corporations in the way that they're doing. You talked about Trump on Twitter, but we've seen DeSantis follow some of the similar tactics.
Oh, yeah.
We don't have to get into politics yet. We will, but certainly a front runner for the presidency. What do you make of our division? Are we permanently divided? What's happened to America? Are there things we agree on? I mean, one interesting...
How much time do you have?
I know, we have, well, that's how much time we have. We have a lot of time. But seriously, like there are people who, smart people who think that we should be more in an EU type model where states like New York can have their own rules around everything from reproductive freedom to marriage equality, and other states can make their own decisions around guns, and we come together to defend ourselves in times of war, right? Because we just don't have that much in common anymore. Where do you fall on that?
Well, that's a lovely thought, but I kind of like to traffic in the plausible, The debate over what decisions should be made locally versus federally, that's as old as time itself. And interestingly, there again, you bump up against some Republican contradictions, which if there were two things that were supposed to define the Republican Party, one was kind of free enterprise, limited regulations, that sort of thing. Another was local control. Right. But you will find, and this sort of hypocrisy travels in both parties, that Republicans love local control when it means that a given place can divorce itself from something that they disagree with, but they don't love local control when that locality is doing something that's antithetical to their philosophy or what they want. So that's a dishonestly fought battle from the get-go. You mentioned DeSantis, though. I want to go back to him. I think he's a very interesting kind of siren warning for corporations. We live in an era where everything is politicized, just about everything. And the guardrails are gone in terms of so much political behavior. And I think he got so much traction, the kind of traction he wanted. He got such applause from his base. He got such just saturation national attention for fighting with the Disney company in that way, that I guarantee you that and because this is just a matter of like political logic, I guarantee you that any and all of the politicians who are thinking of challenging him for the nomination in 2024, assuming he runs, they're looking for their own fights to pick. They're looking for fights that will get the maximum media attention. They're looking for fights that will endear the base. And they're looking at companies and corporations. And that is no longer out of bounds. They view what he did with Disney as something to be emulated, and it will be emulated.
So I don't want to press you on this, but I know everyone here.
What does a company do?
Yeah, what is a company to do? What is a brand to do when the target for every brand is young people? Young people feel really strongly about
Not for every
issues,
brand.
right? for many brands. For many brands, it's sort of the holy grail, right? You get them for life. For corporations who are hearing from their employees, you said that paradigm has shifted. It may shift back with a looming recession and job loss, and
right.
Job security becomes more and more important,
yeah.
and maybe that will change.
Yeah.
And that's what will ultimately reverse it with the cyclical economy. But how would you counsel a corporation, a brand who's wrestling with these issues, who has employees who say, we need to take a stand on the Equality Act. We have we care about our employees the way Howard Schultz did, who I know you're friendly with at Starbucks, was one of the first to take these big stands on social issues at the time. There weren't that many who were trying to appeal to all of America with their product who were doing it. Now everyone seems to have to do it. But as you said, there could be some significant consequences around license to operate in the coming years.
Well, no, everyone, I don't know that everyone has to do it. Most corporations ends up having to do some of it. but there are degrees of vividness, there are degrees of passion with which you can do it. I mean, there are ways of drawing more and less attention to yourself. I don't think it's possible to give someone counsel on how do you reconcile these things, how do you navigate it, because there are these things that are in conflict, there are tough decisions that are going to have to be made. What I think, and this is going to sound evasive, but I don't mean it that way, what I think a company has to do these days is recognize that these issues are there, that these decisions and tensions are there, and make sure they're doing what they mean to be doing. They need to pause and say, okay, here are the range of responses that we could have. Here are the kinds of challenges that are likely to come down the pike, right? And they need to just make sure what they're doing is what they mean to be doing and that they've thought through what the possible reverberations are, because there's just no escaping it anymore. Some companies have turned it to their advantage. I mean, look at Dick's Sporting Goods, right? Wasn't it in 2019 after Parkland, they decided to stop selling guns. And it surprised a lot of people because that didn't seem entirely consistent with Dick's demographics. I believe the stock ended up going up. I don't know that you can do a cause and effect, but I don't think there has been any bottom line focused regret over what they did. In that case, and I want to mention this because I think this should never exit the conversation, in that case, I think it was a reflection of leadership's principles and of leadership's kind of genuine emotional and moral reaction to school shootings. That can be part of it too. There's nothing that says you can't or shouldn't take moral stands. You just have to be prepared for what the range of consequences could be for those.
Right. I know yesterday it was a big topic of conversation, this idea of disinformation and truth and an inability to agree on fact anymore. We were talking to Paul in the wings about that earlier as well. From a media perspective, what's your take on it? How prominent was social media in getting us to this place? Is the genie out of the bottle permanently? Can we ever get back to fact-based conversation?
I don't know. I want to be your vessel of hope, but you mentioned the genie bottle metaphor. It's a good one. The internet, social media, the initial promise was they were going to bring us together. They were going to connect us. And there are instances and ways in which they've been powerful connectors. There are positive social movements that owe their velocity to the internet and social media and all of that. But I think the greater effect that we're all wrestling with now, and no one has a solution, is that people now have the ability to curate their own reality, right? I mean, when I'm a little older than you, but when I was growing up, you know, there were the four network or quasi-network newscasts. Like if you were getting news in the evening, there was no internet, the newspaper had come out in the morning, so you either watched the evening news on CBS, ABC, NBC, or PBS, right? And it was a half hour, an hour, and those broadcasts felt the need to sort of do a little bit of something for everyone. And those broadcasts became the starting point of conversations, the kind of common set of facts. There were huge problems with that. These decisions were made by a very narrow band of people, not a very diverse group of people, and that was reflected in much of the coverage and was bad. But at least we were all on the same page to a certain extent. We were kind of having our conversations from the same starting point. Now you can believe that you are deeply engaged and profoundly informed because you spent 4 hours on the internet and because you've bookmarked 10 sites or followed 40 different Twitter accounts that send you links. And what you're doing is you've gone to the vast buffet of possibility and you've just heaped your plate with slice after slice of tenderloin or with sprig after sprig of broccoli. And you feel well fed, but you're not, right? Not only that, but you with all your broccoli can't talk to her with all of her red meat, you know, because you're not even in the same nutritional spectrum. I don't know how we get past that because the sorts of things you might do to restrict that bump up in such disturbing ways against free speech, against free enterprise, that I think one of the few things we are starting to explore and need to explore more is incorporating some notions or actually curriculum and media literacy at the school level in teaching young people before it's too late, that there's that information comes in different qualities, or with different kind of degrees of quality, that you need to ask yourself where something's coming from. You need to kind of make a conscious effort. When I talk to people about, you know, what is your news diet, you find that most people have constructed their news diets without a whole lot of thought. They don't mean to be eating only broccoli or only steak. It's just human nature to sort of, oh, I like this person, I like that thing, click, click, click. And then you've assembled this without even realizing what you've done and without fully realizing what sort of echo chamber you live in. So I think we need to find ways to build consciousness so that those people who are inclined to a different approach can be pointed in that direction.
So two things I've noticed, and I'm wondering if you have as well, and what your take is on it. I don't know if it's the right phrase anymore, but mainstream media has gotten a little bit more aggressive recently. Maybe it's post-Trump and less fear in calling out on truth, right? Mm-hmm. They will literally say someone has denied the election, but we know that the election was won by Biden. Right. They will call out fact. Are you seeing more of that? Has there been a change? Do you think they were too permissive to let the president get away with telling lies boldly and sort of running with it without correcting?
This all stems from, this all is the outgrowth, I think, of the discussion in the first years of the Trump presidency around whether you could use the word lie or not. And to what extent he's the president of the United States, he's the most influential person in one of our two big political parties. To what extent were you obliged to put on the record and repeat what he said? And what allowance could you give yourself for literally saying that's a lie, that's untrue? I think that has paved the way to, you're seeing coverage now that said, Putin falsely claimed.
Right.
Denies the election despite no evidence to support that. It was an important element of COVID coverage. A lot of the kind of false health myths out there were reported in the media as not just another perspective, but as a conspiracy theory afoot. The problem is that the people whom that needs to reach are probably not reading the New York Times, or they're hate reading it to spot that stuff and say, look at how biased this is. It's the right response, but I don't think it's going to get us nearly where we need to go. I'm not recommending the alternative, but I just don't think it solves the problem. It's an honorable gesture we should continue, but not be fooled into thinking it's the solution for everything.
Right, so let's stick with that for a second, because you're right, a lot of people are not getting their information from the mainstream media. So
a lot of people don't get much information at all.
At all. This is another issue.
We're sitting here right now reading, if you all are even a quarter as engaged as I am, I'm sure you're twice as engaged as I am. Every day we're reading stories about what will happen in the midterms, suppositions, hypotheses about voter behavior. I want to just tell you one story that I think I always keep in mind when I'm reading or hearing pundits analyze the election in rational ways, because how do you do an analysis that's not rational, right? You're sort of the only tool or kind of orientation you have. Years ago, I was doing a profile for the New York Times Sunday magazine on Carly Fiorina. She was running it was her entry into politics, or her first attempted entry into politics. She never got there. And she was running in California for the Senate against Barbara Boxer, who was running for re-election. And she was hard up enough for attention that even though I was from the New York Times, and even then, we were vilified by conservatives and Republicans, she let me spend an enormous amount of time with her. I rode around with her and her husband in their black campaign SUV with the 2 Yorkshire Terriers, and we were a happy little unit. We went to this event in San Jose that was sort of like a Republican candidate Coachella. It was like one Republican candidate after another. And she had to go back to some green room, so we had to separate. And there was just this, this sea of people who turned out to hear the candidates. And it was crowded, and so I figured, okay, here's an opportunity to talk to voters, right? I've got time to burn, I'm not with Carly, and these must be super engaged voters if they came out on this beautiful day in San Jose to hear these candidates. And the people in the front must be super duper engaged voters because they had to get here really early to get those good seats. To further make sure I had interesting, informed voters, I picked this couple who were sitting in lawn chairs, and they had pennants and banners and buttons and more swag than I've ever seen. And I walk up to them and I say, hey, are you here just to hear all the candidates, anyone in particular? I'm just curious if you've come to any strong feelings about Carly Fiorina. And they looked really thoughtful, like I was about to get some major profundity. And the woman said, we haven't decided yet between Carly Fiorina and Meg Whitman. And I said, boy, I'm going to make your day. They're not running against each other. Meg is running for governor and Carly's running for senator. My point is, that's actually closer to the average American voter. than the kind of person we conjure when we're doing these fine-grained analyses of how people are going to vote.
As you said, you're not going to give us that much hope today. That's very depressing. but let me stick with this for another minute on social media. Absolutely, we get our information in our own curated ways. As you said, I want a lot of broccoli, so that's where I am. There's one thing to get your news from a curated place that's not, Dan Rather, everyone is listening to him in the country, versus getting patently false statements online, right? What do you think is the responsibility of these social media companies to police around fact versus issues like hate crime, intolerant speech, all of the other issues that people would put in the woke category? But what about fact? And especially in the midst of a global pandemic, I know there was a panel yesterday on healthcare and truth in that. That was very devastating. You saw our outcomes in the US, given how great our healthcare system is comparatively. The death rate here, stunning, right? Because we didn't really curry in fact. We didn't listen to public health authorities. They were demonized. What's the responsibility of the companies?
I think they do need to police against untruth, and I think Twitter has been right to suspend many of the accounts that they have. I think Facebook was really, really slow to this, and they've come around to admitting as much. I think they do have a responsibility, and I think when they fail to do that, I think it is proper and correct that they be called out for it in front of Congress as they have been. I just don't know what we do in the realm of law, because it is very, very difficult to craft laws that would compel them to do that in an effective way without ending up in a place where you're really trampling over the First Amendment. And I get worried about government getting too involved in it, because if you let government get super involved at one moment, you may have empowered government to get involved at a later moment when the times are different and the people making decisions are different, and you've set a precedent for this control coming from on high. And you have to, if you're going to set that precedent, you have to realize that some of the people who will be using that precedent may not be people you trust. So you have to be careful.
Yeah, you mentioned Twitter and taking people off the platform or bots off the platform for promoting untruth. How much has Twitter changed politics and the political conversation? How much of it is unique to what we just experienced with Trump and a celebrity president? Do you think it's just a new normal, and how important is it going forward?
Well, Twitter, interestingly, I kind of don't understand the full magnitude of media coverage of it, like in terms of when Elon Musk was buying it, he wasn't buying it, he was buying. I mean, it's like Chinatown, my sister, my daughter, I've lost total track, right? But Twitter, you have to remember, very, very few Americans, very few voters spend any time on Twitter, right? The problem is so many influencers watch it, use it as a barometer. It's a false barometer. So many politicians use it. So many of the kinds of voters who give money and vote in primaries are the kinds of people who are more likely to be on Twitter. And they speak in very divisive ways. They speak in very unnuanced ways. And they have absolutely influenced the way politicians speak and the way the rest of us speak. And the way op-ed columnists sometimes write. There's this sort of premium on screed that didn't exist to the same extent before, and that absolutely to some degree reflects what rises to the top. I hate to call it the top, but what rises to attention versus what doesn't on Twitter.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk for a minute about hypersensitivity and the hypersensitive American. And one example. GLAAD, a couple of years ago with the Gina Davis Institute, came out with a study during the Cannes Lions. They evaluated all the ads that were entered for awards and found that only 1.8% of those award-worthy advertisements depicted an LGBTQIA person or family, 1.8%. And then they dug deeper to try to understand why. And they interviewed a lot of the brands and corporations that had put out the ads. And they essentially said, it's not that we don't want to, we very much want to, but we're afraid. And what we're afraid of is the backlash from the people we're actually trying to support, because we're worried about getting it wrong, right? You depict the person in a wrong way, it's a stereotype, you get the backlash from the very community you're trying to give vision to. You're hypersensitive about that. Hypersensitive about Americans being hypersensitive. You're now on a college campus, the great, breeding ground experimentation for all of these movements. What are you experiencing with young people today?
Well, it's funny, as you were saying that, just I'll mention this because it illustrates a couple of different things. Just last week, a week ago, I lose track of time, Bret Stephens, who's a columnist at the Times, a conservative columnist and a friend, he came down to Duke to do a public event with me and to visit my opinion writing class. I would venture to, I don't have to guess, but most of my students don't share Bret's political views. They completely understood the value of having him there. They were utterly courteous, and they were interested and engaged and respectful and all those things. Bret asked them at one point, toward the end of the class after they'd asked him their questions, he asked them, how many of you hesitate to speak up in groups of your peers in classes because you're worried that you'll be judged harshly for what you said? And almost everyone in the class raised their hands. But to what you were just saying, it turned out that when he probed a little deeper, and then when I returned to it the week after he was there in his absence, some of them were talking about, quote unquote, political correctness, but many of them were talking about the very thing you mentioned kept those ads from being more diverse. They worry about saying something wrong. They worry about being stupid. They worry about causing an offense that's caused by their ignorance, not an offense that gets them canceled. But I have found, at least at Duke, that the caricature of college campuses is just that, a caricature. There is absolutely some truth to it. It doesn't come from nowhere. But I have made it a personal mission at the beginning, the first session of every class I've taught. I have made it clear that all viewpoints, except for ones that are overtly hateful, are welcome in the class. I am really careful when I see a student making a point that is ideologically diverse, and that may be a little hard for them to make. I make sure to send every signal in the world that I welcome that. And my classes have been arenas of really kind of vigorous and diverse discussion. I think a lot of the failure here is the failure of faculty to trust students, to point them in the right direction. And they're so worried about something happening in a classroom that's going to end up causing them grief, that they're doing as much to shut down the conversations as the actual students are. So that's where I think the media coverage is wrong. It puts it all on the students. I don't think it's fair or right.
Great. Speaking of questions, I want to get to the room and also a global audience that's watching this streaming, of course. But very quickly, maybe rapid fire, because I know everyone will want to hear from you. Midterms, less than 2 weeks. We want to hear your take on the midterms. Biden 2024, will he, won't he? Maybe same for Trump.
I mean, I know nothing that anybody else doesn't know. It feels very much to me that Republicans are going to take the House, and probably not by just a little bit of a margin. But we live in an era where all bets are off. I'm worried about the Senate, but I don't know. I say worried because I would like to see Democrats maintain control there. And that is a slightly partisan statement, sure, but I mean, right now I think we have, and I don't want to put us in an even more gloomy direction, but we're in a very dangerous moment in terms of our democracy. When you have people, one party is where denial of election results and that sort of thing is more prevalent, and that's why I say I'm worried Democrats won't hold on to the Senate, but I don't know. I think Biden's going to let us know what's going to happen pretty soon, right? Because I think he is a civic-minded person. I think he is a person who cares about the future of his party. I think it's one of the reasons he ran. And I think he realizes that if another Democrat is to have an adequate chance to raise the money, build the support, develop the velocity necessary to succeed, he can't be making his decision about whether to run again or not in July of next year. It needs to be in the months after the midterms. My gut is he's not going to run again, but I have this conversation every day with smart people in politics, smart analysts, and you ask 100 people and you'll get 50 saying one thing and 50 saying the other, and what you learn is nobody knows. Jill Biden probably knows, nobody else.
Trump,
will he run? I think he will, but I think I'm in the minority there. I think he will because I think he can't stand not being the center of attention.
Yeah.
And the minute he decides not to run, even if he's playing puppet master and kingmaker in the background, he's in the background. If he's not running and Ron DeSantis is getting more attention, I don't think he can live with that. I think the more interesting question is, despite what is said about when you poll Republicans now or whatever, I'm not at all convinced if Trump wins that he gets the nomination.
Right.
At all, because there are so many, whether it's Ron DeSantis or Carrie Lake, or there are so many MAGA Republicans who do some of the stuff he does so much better than he did it and with so much less crazy, that I think we've always overestimated the number of voters who are responding to Trump the person versus Trump the policies. I know that sounds weird, but I think there are going to be many Republican voters who are going to realize, wait, I can get much of the MAGA stuff I like without the kind of wild card, without the uncontrollable variable that is Donald Trump as a candidate.
Great. I'd love to open it up to the room and to the global audience. If anyone has a question in the room, can you raise your hand? A mic will come to you. I see one.
I can't really see, can you?
I know, no, but I see a mic. I think a mic is being brought over.
Sorry, I have a question.
Oh.
Sorry.
Oh,
I have
go.
a question that came in online while we're waiting for the mics to show up. The populism that we've seen in America is a global phenomenon. The person who wrote in referenced Modi and what's going on in Italy. And how much of this can be attributed to a failure of capitalism to deliver for ordinary people? How much of this is just a feeling that no party is going to make things change, and so you might as well elect an agent of chaos?
I think that question sort of answered itself in the sense that it is both of those things. You mentioned Modi, you could talk about Brazil, you could talk about any number of countries, you could talk about the Philippines. But yeah, the people who were doing well, the people who have done well in our capitalist societies, I think showed insufficient concern or consciousness of just how unequal the rewards were. You get to a certain kind of inequality and whoa, I mean, who would have thunk it? Many people are like, I don't like the rules of this game. I don't like the way this game is being played. I don't like the people who are setting those rules and who are the coaches, the umpires, whatever you want to call them, because I don't feel like there's a way for me to win. Those situations are unsustainable. But there also is, I think in all these countries, certainly in ours, people who have grown so disillusioned, who so enjoy the feeling of being disillusioned and enraged and filled with grievance, that they do like to support destructionists, chaos candidates. Everything they do is a protest gesture or a protest vote. And I understand that emotionally, but that's not going to get us anywhere good. And it compels us, just as the people who are making a rational complaint about how they've not gotten an equal shot at things, it compels us to find a better way to do things, because that way lies chaos and ruin.
I could have just stolen Paul's mic, I guess. Aaron Quitkin with Profit and Stagwell. I came in a little late. I don't know if you talked about Adidas. Did you?
Yeah.
Briefly, but
Okay, I'll sit back down. Did you talk about why it took so long? Okay, I'll sit back down.
We didn't talk about why it took so long, but we talked about the fact that it took long. And I'm not sure Adidas is going to get much credit. There aren't going to be many kudos for what it did, because I think to many observers did it at the last possible minute rather than the first. So I think there's a lesson in that, that if things are trending in a direction, if the right thing to do, if there's a clear right thing to do, and if you're prepared to do that, do it sooner rather than later, because then it will seem like a truer reflection of your values, and then you'll get some credit for it.
Right. Well, right, because the perception was, of course, that they're putting, livelihood versus life, right? And they weren't necessarily balancing that the right way. My theory, of course, just in case anybody wants to know, because we're all communicators here, is that the lawyers probably got in the way of a really good decision, and they wanted to work it out with the lawyers first, which is terrible.
my guess is we're going to learn exactly what happened, because this is, there's a phrase we use in the business, a tick-tock, right? Which is a story that kind of looks backward, and several weeks after some big news event has happened, when you have enough weeks to talk to principals, when people get a little bit less scared of talking, you end up getting a blow-by-blow or something close to an account of what led to a given place. I think we will be reading any number of TikToks about the unraveling of Kanye on a personal level, and of what various corporations were doing and not doing, and who was or wasn't impeding them as they got to the place they ultimately got to. I think we'll read those stories in the months to come. I imagine there'll be a book at some point, and we'll know exactly what happened.
Well, thanks for repeating that just for me. I appreciate it.
Good morning, Bess Winston, Finn Partners. I'm curious, right here. Oh,
Frank.
That's okay.
Even if I had better eyes, all I would see
That's
is
okay.
watch
I'm
it right.
fangirling right here anyway. So I'm curious about your opinion, if you have one, of Margaret Sullivan's point of view that in today's age, the traditional unbiased role of journalist has to take a sharp pivot because of the peril of democracy.
I think I'm not familiar with exactly how Margaret has worded that. I know Margaret, and she's actually going to be teaching at Duke with me next semester. We're not teaching a course together. She's going to be a colleague. I think what Margaret's saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is I think she's saying we can't let this goal of objectivity prevent us from calling out things that need to be called out. And I think she's basically in the territory Brian and I were talking about calling a lie, including the word falsely next to a claim. I think she's talking about doing, if you want to see kind of a really good example of what I think is a more educated, illuminated media doing what Margaret's recommending, go look online at Dana Bash's interview with Carrie Lake from about a week and a half ago. In fact, I wrote about this for a column that'll be published tomorrow. And every time Carrie Lake said, election integrity is the most important issue, blah, blah, Dana said, please tell me why you say that. Where's the evidence in Arizona? Now, of course, Arizona's been a place where election denialism has been especially potent, but there's also been probes into what happened in the vote, and it's shown nothing irregular. It's shown nothing that justifies those complaints. But I think when Margaret's talking about we should not let some nebulous idea of on the one hand, on the other objectivity prevent us in certain situations from conveying the unquestionable truth. She's right. I don't think she's saying that in news reporting across the board, objectivity should go out the window. I believe that you should enter a situation that you're reporting on, open to any facts that emerge, and with a willingness to present all the facts that you discover, and to describe how different people feel those facts are relevant, and how those facts and what those facts should lead to by way of action. I think that is still a noble goal, and I think Margaret would support that too. And there is at the same time a burgeoning amount of opinion writing in which those principles don't apply. And we have that, and that can be very relevant and persuasive. And so I think it allows the idea of not going in with a closed mind and agenda if you are a news reporter, not in the opinion realm. I think it allows that approach to continue.
Thank you.
Jeff Joseph, BCW. Two questions. First, you're speaking to a room full of communicators. What's our role in sort of stopping the single broccoli eater and encouraging people to have a broader media diet? And the second question, you sort of joked that you weren't going to bring much optimism, but you talked about the conversation in your classrooms. Have you seen those result in a changing of the mind, or do your students sort of retreat back to their own corners? Can you give us a little bit of hope?
Well, I mean, I can't say if I've seen changing of minds. I just don't have a long enough study. I've been at Duke for, 15 months. But I mean, what makes me hopeful is what has happened in those classrooms. I have not seen, I've had some students who are very far to the left. I've not had one of them come within the vicinity of trying to shut down or kind of cruelly silence a student who was, say, center-right. I can't say I have any students who are right-wing. I just don't think there are many students who are there, and if they're at Duke, I think they are silent. I think they're not taking my classes.
They're there.
Yeah, but I mean, that gives me enormous hope. I'm glad you asked about what we can do. What we can do is both investigate our own media consumption and talk to people about what we're consuming and what we found valuable, especially if those things we're finding valuable are more politically and intellectually heterodox, right? So, you know, if you go to realclearpolitics.com, which I'm a fan of for the reason I'm about to give, you find a curated group of links twice a day that are from across the spectrum of possible media organizations. You will find stuff from the New York Times and the Washington Post. You'll find stuff from Breitbart. Now, I don't know if I'm happy about that, but the point is, if you want to be aware of what's being said everywhere and the various ways people are looking at things, you can do it that way. But what I really wanted to use your question to say, which is sort of adjacent to it or maybe even right on it, you're getting, all of us, no one ever talks about this, all of us are getting the news that we want, the news that we deserve more than ever before, right? 20 years ago, if a company like the New York Times wanted to know what was resonating with readers, what was popular, it would basically have to assemble an imperfect focus group, which you can only make it so big and do it so often, and kind of interview readers about what they were responding to. They didn't really know, right? Now, at any given moment, you can look at this list called Trending on the New York Times website, and it shows you which 13 stories in which order are have the most eyeballs on them at that moment in time. The Times and pretty much every other online publication or publication with an online wing, and most of our readers are online, can tell you how many clicks a story got, how many minutes on average someone spent with that story, whether they came to that story via a Google search or via a link on Twitter or Facebook or via the homepage itself of the New York Times. We know everything about what readers are doing, and invariably our coverage reflects that because we need those readers to stay in business. So after the 2016 election, if I would come, talk to people like we're talking here, I would constantly get the question, why did you all put so much Donald Trump in the paper? Shame on you. We put so much Trump in the paper. I mean, there were totally defensible journalistic reasons for it, but there was also so much Trump in the paper and in other places because that's what people were clicking on. And if people had clicked with that enthusiasm and in those numbers on John Kasich articles, you would have read a lot more about John Kasich. We all have the ability with our own consumption patterns to influence the media we get, and we need to take responsibility for that.
Another question. Are there skills that we should be teaching? I've got a mic. Are there skills that we should be teaching young people before they get to college, in secondary schools or in high schools or wherever you are, that can help them decipher the disinformation out there and figure out what trusted information should look like?
Yes, there are, but it's really an old-fashioned skill just in a new outfit. We should be teaching them skepticism. We should be teaching them not to immediately, but this is something we should always have been teaching them. We should never stop teaching them. It just has stakes and it has new applications from the past. But we should be teaching young people not to take everything they hear on face value. We should be teaching them the kind of intellectual art of what in journalism we would call follow-up questions. We should be teaching them to investigate and be aware of the provenance of things. We should be teaching them how to recognize when something that they are hearing or reading is simply duplicative of and an anagram of something they heard and read before versus added value, added information. Those are things that are going to make them better human beings and citizens across the board. But we're teaching them skepticism. It's just the applications for that skepticism and the stakes of it are different and higher.
So if there isn't another question, I have one this one is actually from me. Because I love that idea, except the people who were all over Twitter telling their friends to use hydroxychloroquine, or whatever it's, I'm sorry, pronounced, were people who said, be skeptical. What they're telling you is not true. Go out and drink Drano instead. I mean, skepticism was the guise under which misinformation, I mean, around climate change, around everything else, was coming into the conversation. How do that? Skepticism on its own is a double-edged sword, right?
Well, I mean, they were just using that. I mean, not all skepticism is created equal. They were just using that word. But I mean, true skepticism isn't about doubting everything, including if 95% of scientists who've studied an issue say X. Skepticism isn't saying I'm going to be the bold iconoclast who goes with the 5% who haven't done the same research. I mean, true skepticism is about asking intelligent questions and then accepting those answers that are the fruit of intelligent investigation. And I think what you're talking about is a kind of, it's not really a skepticism, it's almost a nihilism, you know, where all expertise is devalued, all expertise is ipso facto suspicious because it's coming from that class of eggheads that we can never trust.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, buddy.